Uncover Poirot's Secrets, where Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot reveals thrilling mysteries. A chilling scream pierces the night at Blackthorn Manor, where a grand dinner party hides dark secrets. Major Ernest Caldwell is found dead, a bullet through his temple, his own revolver by his side. Was it suicide or a cunning murder? A cryptic note warns of a shadow that moves at midnight, yet the clock struck 9. Why the discrepancy? Who screamed, and what did they see? Enter Hercule Poirot, the brilliant Belgian detective whose little gray cells unravel a web of lies, betrayal, and poison that links to a deadly past. In this closed-circle mystery, every guest is a suspect, every clue a puzzle piece. Can Poirot expose the killer before the shadow strikes again? Dive into secrets and surprising twists, where elegance masks evil, and the truth is more shocking than you dare imagine. Chapter 1. The Gathering at Blackthorn Manor. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Blackthorn Manor, a sprawling estate nestled in the heart of the Sussex countryside. The year was 1938, and the air carried the crisp promise of autumn, tinged with the faint scent of wood smoke from the village beyond the estate's iron gates. The manor itself, a grand Jacobean structure of weathered stone and ivy-clad towers, stood as a monument to old wealth and older secrets. Its tall windows gleamed like watchful eyes, reflecting the golden light as guests arrived for what was to be a most unusual weekend. Captain Arthur Hastings, ever the loyal friend and chronicler of Hercule Poirot's exploits, stepped from the chauffeured Rolls-Royce that had brought him from the station. He adjusted his hat and surveyed the scene with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The invitation to Blackthorn Manor had been unexpected, penned in the elegant hand of Lady Evelyn Ashbourne, the widow of the late Sir Reginald Ashbourne, whose fortune in shipping had made the family a pillar of British society. The letter had promised a weekend of delightful company and stimulating conversation, but Hastings, seasoned by years at Poirot's side, sensed an undercurrent of something less. The guests, already assembled, turned to greet him, their smiles polite but guarded. Lady Evelyn Ashbourne, a tall woman in her late 50s with silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, rose from a high-backed chair. Her black silk dress whispered of mourning, though her sharp green eyes betrayed no trace of grief. "Captain Hastings, how good of you to join us," she said, her voice smooth yet commanding. "I trust your journey was pleasant?" "Quite, thank you," Hastings replied, shaking her hand. He noted the firmness of her grip, the way her gaze lingered a fraction too long, as if assessing him. The other guests were an eclectic mix, each introduced with the practiced ease of a hostess accustomed to managing egos. There was Dr. Malcolm Reed, a wiry neurologist with a nervous habit of adjusting his spectacles. Mrs. Clara Whitmore, a vivacious widow in her 40s whose laughter seemed to mask a deeper unease. Mr. Lionel Vance, a barrister with a penchant for brandy and a booming voice, and Miss Beatrice Lyle, a young heiress whose delicate features and quiet demeanor belied a keen intelligence. Finally, there was Major Ernest Caldwell, a retired military man with a ruddy complexion and a tendency to scowl at the modern world. As tea was served, the conversation flowed with the superficial charm of a society gathering. Yet Hastings, ever attuned to the subtleties of human behavior, detected a strain beneath the pleasantries. Dr. Reed's hands trembled slightly as he reached for a scone. Mrs. Whitmore's laughter rang a touch too shrill. Major Caldwell's eyes darted toward the door whenever a servant entered. And Lady Ashburn, for all her poise, seemed to be watching them all, with an intensity that bordered on predatory. "It is a pity Monsieur Poirot could not join us," Lady Ashburn remarked, stirring her tea with a silver spoon. "I had hoped to meet the famous detective. His reputation for unraveling mysteries is quite extraordinary." Hastings smiled, accustomed to such remarks. "Poirot sends his regrets, Lady Ashburn. He is, shall we say, detained by his own affairs in London. Dress for dinner." Hastings retired to his room, a spacious chamber with a four-poster bed and a view of the darkening woods beyond. As he unpacked his suitcase, he found a note slipped beneath his door, written in a hurried, unfamiliar hand. "Beware the shadow that moves at midnight. Trust no one." Hastings frowned, turning the note over in his hands. It was unsigned, the ink slightly smudged, as if written in haste. He tucked it into his pocket, his heart quickening. "A prank, perhaps," he muttered, though he knew better. In his years with Poirot, he had learned that such warnings, however cryptic, were rarely without purpose. Dinner was a formal affair, served in a dining room aglow with candlelight. The table was set with silver and porcelain, and the meal, roast pheasant, glazed carrots, and a rich claret, was impeccable. Yet the atmosphere was strained. Miss Lyle barely touched her food, her eyes fixed on her plate. Dr. Reed spoke at length about neurological disorders, his words tinged with an odd urgency. Mrs. Whitmore flirted shamelessly with Mr. Vance, who seemed more interested in his wine. Major Caldwell, seated at the head of the table, muttered about the decline of the empire, while Lady Ashburn presided with a serene smile that never reached her eyes. As the dessert course was cleared, a piercing scream shattered the silence. It came from the direction of the library, a room adjacent to the dining hall. The guests froze, their faces a tableau of shock and fear. Hastings was the first to move, his military instincts kicking in. He pushed back his chair and strode toward the sound, the others trailing behind. In the library, they found a scene of chaos. A heavy bronze candelabrum lay overturned on the floor, its candles extinguished. The French windows leading to the terrace were ajar, letting in a gust of cold night air. And there, slumped in an armchair by the fire, was Major Caldwell, his face ashen, his eyes wide with terror, and a thin trickle of blood seeping from a wound at his temple. Mrs. Whitmore gasped, "Shadow of death." The library at Blackthorn Manor was now a tableau of grim silence, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire and the distant wail of the wind through the open French windows. Major Ernest Caldwell's body remained slumped in the armchair, his lifeless eyes staring into the void, the blood from his temple now congealing into a dark stain on the velvet upholstery. The guests stood in a loose semicircle, their faces pale under the flickering candlelight, each grappling with the shock of the moment. Captain Arthur Hastings, his heart still pounding from the discovery, took charge with the calm authority of a man accustomed to crisis. "Mrs. Whitmore, please, sit down before you faint," Hastings said, guiding the trembling widow to a nearby sofa. Her earlier vivacity had vanished, replaced by a pallor that made her rouge stand out starkly against her cheeks. She clutched a handkerchief, her eyes darting nervously toward the open windows. Lady Evelyn Ashburn, ever the composed hostess, issued quiet instructions to the butler, who had appeared at the door, his face a mask of professional restraint. Simmons, telephone the police at once, and ensure the staff remain in their quarters until further notice. No one is to enter or leave this room." "Yes, my lady," Simmons replied, bowing slightly before retreating with measured steps. Dr. Malcolm Reed, still kneeling beside the body, adjusted his spectacles and spoke in a low, unsteady voice. "The wound is clean. A single shot to the temple. Death must have been instantaneous. The revolver." He gestured toward the weapon on the floor, its polished barrel glinting in the firelight. "It appears to be the Major's own." Hastings crouched beside the doctor, careful not to disturb the scene. The revolver, a Webley Mark VI, was indeed the one Major Caldwell had brandished proudly during pre-dinner drinks, boasting of its service in the Great War. Hastings noted its position, slightly to the right of the armchair, as if dropped by a limp hand. The French windows ajar and swaying slightly, and anyone see the Major enter the library? A murmur passed through the group, but no one admitted to seeing Caldwell leave the dining room. The timeline was murky. Dessert had been served at 8:45 p.m., and the scream had come at precisely 9:02, according to the mantel clock. The Major had been seated at the head of the table, grumbling about the quality of the claret when the meal concluded. How had he slipped away unnoticed? Lady Ashbourne's voice cut through the speculation. "We must not jump to conclusions. The police will investigate, and I have every confidence they will uncover the truth. Captain Hastings, you mentioned sending for Monsieur Poirot. Might you do so immediately?" Hastings nodded, though his mind was already racing through the details of the scene. The note he had found in his room, "Beware the shadow that moves at midnight," now seemed less like a prank and more like a portent. Had it been a warning about Caldwell's death? Or was something darker yet to come? He excused himself to the hall where a telephone stood on a polished side table. Dialing Poirot's London flat, he was relieved when the familiar voice answered, crisp and precise despite the late hour. "Mon ami Hastings, what is this urgency that disturbs Hercule Poirot's evening repose?" "Poirot, it's murder," Hastings said, keeping his voice low. "Major Caldwell, shot dead at Blackthorn Manor. The police are on their way, but Lady Ashbourne insists you come. There's something off about this. I can't place it, but I need your little gray cells." A pause, then Poirot's voice tinged with curiosity. "Murder, you say? And at Blackthorn Manor, the home of the late Sir Reginald Ashbourne. Très intéressant. I shall take the first train tomorrow morning. Until then, Hastings, observe everything. Note the positions, the expressions, the words unspoken. And touch nothing." "Understood," Hastings replied, though he felt a pang of inadequacy. Poirot's instructions were always so precise, yet the chaos of a fresh crime scene felt overwhelming without his husband's death. Poison, some had whispered, though never proven. Was it coincidence that another death had occurred under her roof? As the group waited, Hastings took mental notes as Poirot had instructed. The library was a large, rectangular room with tall bookshelves lining 3 walls. The 4th wall held the French windows, which opened onto a stone terrace overlooking the gardens. A heavy oak desk stood near the windows, its surface cluttered with papers, an inkstand, and a small silver cigarette case. The armchair where Caldwell died faced the fireplace, positioned at an angle that would have given him a clear view of the room, but not the windows behind him. Hastings approached the desk, careful not to touch anything. The cigarette case caught his eye. It was monogrammed with the initials E.C., presumably Ernest Caldwell's. But something about it seemed odd. The case was open, revealing a single cigarette, its tip slightly crumpled. Had the Major been smoking before his death? No ashtray was nearby, and the air, though tinged with gunpowder, carried no trace of tobacco. A sudden thought struck him. He glanced at the floor near the armchair where a small folded piece of paper lay, half hidden beneath a rug. Kneeling, he peered at it without touching it. A torn scrap of notepaper, with the words "at midnight" scrawled in the same hurried hand as the note in his pocket. His pulse quickened. The connection was undeniable. But what did it mean? Before he could ponder further, the distant sound of a police siren pierced the night. The authorities had arrived, and with them, the machinery of investigation would begin. Yet Hastings knew that only Poirot, with his unparalleled ability to see order in chaos, could unravel the truth behind Major Caldwell's death. For now, the shadow of murder hung over Blackthorn Manor, and every guest, every clue, seemed to whisper of secrets yet to be uncovered. Chapter 3. The Arrival of Hercule Poirot. The morning sun struggled through the heavy clouds that hung over Blackthorn Manor, casting a pallid light across the estate's dew-soaked lawns. The police had arrived shortly after midnight. Precise flick of his fingers. His green eyes, sharp as cut glass, swept over the scene, taking in the somber atmosphere and the nervous footman hovering nearby. "Mon cher Hastings," Poirot exclaimed, his voice warm but tinged with curiosity. "You have summoned me to a most intriguing affair. A murder, you say, in the heart of this grand maison? Tell me all, but slowly, for the little gray cells must have order." Hastings recounted the events of the previous evening. The dinner, the scream, the discovery of Major Caldwell's body, and the troubling details. The open French windows, the cigarette case, the scrap of paper with "at midnight" scrawled upon it. He handed Poirot the note he had found in his room, watching as the detective's eyes narrowed. "Beware the shadow that moves at midnight," Poirot read aloud, his voice soft but deliberate. A warning, perhaps, or a taunt. And this second note found near the body, most curious. The hand is the same, n'est-ce pas? We shall see what it reveals. He tucked both notes into his pocketbook, his expression unreadable. Lady Evelyn Ashbourne appeared in the hall, her black silk dress as pristine as ever, though faint shadows beneath her eyes betrayed a sleepless night. "Monsieur Poirot, I am deeply grateful you've come," she said, extending a hand. "This tragedy has shaken us all. The police believe it to be suicide, but I cannot accept it. Major Caldwell was not a man to take his own life." Poirot inclined his head, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made Hastings shift uncomfortably. "Madame, Hercule Poirot does not accept the conclusions of others until he has examined the facts himself. I shall require access to the library, and I wish to speak with each guest. The truth, it hides in the details, and I shall find it." Inspector Grayson, who had joined them, bristled at Poirot's tone. "With all due respect, Mr. Poirot, this is a straightforward case. The Major shot himself with his own revolver. No signs of a struggle, no foot. The case is otherwise pristine. And no ashtray. Major Caldwell. He was a smoker, yes?" Hastings nodded. "He mentioned it at dinner. Said he preferred Turkish blends, précisément," Poirot said, his eyes gleaming. He turned to the scrap of paper beneath the rug, which the police had overlooked in their haste. Using a handkerchief, he retrieved it and held it to the light. "The ink, it is fresh. The paper torn. This was written in haste, perhaps moments before the crime. But by whom? And why at midnight when the shot was fired at 9? Inspector Grayson coughed, clearly impatient. "All this fuss over a bit of paper, Mr. Poirot." The major was alone, the gun was his, and the windows could have been left open by a servant. Poirot's gaze was withering. "Inspector, in the affairs of murder, there are no coincidences. Every detail, it speaks. And this room, it shouts of something amiss." Leaving the library, Poirot requested to meet the guests in the drawing room. They assembled reluctantly, their faces a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Mrs. Clara Whitmore, her eyes red from crying, clutched a glass of water. Dr. Malcolm Reed adjusted his spectacles repeatedly, his nervous tic more pronounced. Mr. Lionel Vance stood by the fireplace, his bravado tempered by unease. Miss Beatrice Lyle sat primly, her hands folded, but her eyes followed Poirot with quiet intensity. Lady Ashbourne presided over the group, her composure unshaken. "Monsieur Poirot," Vance began, his voice loud but strained. "Surely you don't suspect one of us." The major was a troubled man. War does things to a fellow. Poirot raised a hand, silencing him. "Monsieur Vance, I suspect everyone until I suspect no one. Now, let us establish the facts. Where were each of you at 9:02 p.m. when the scream was heard?" The alibis came quickly, though not without hesitation. Lady Ashbourne had been at the dining table discussing the wine with Simmons. Mrs. Whitmore claimed to have been reapplying her lipstick and the powder. "The alibis are shaky, but there's no clear motive yet." Poirot stopped, his eyes fixed on a small ornament on the mantel. A bronze statuette of a hawk, its beak gleaming. "Motive, Hastings, is like the shadow in your note. It moves, it hides, but it is always there. The major's death is no suicide. The cigarette case, the torn paper, the open windows, they tell a story. And I, Hercule Poirot, shall read it." He turned, his mustache twitching with the faintest smile. "Come, mon ami, the game is afoot, and the little gray cells, they are already at work." Chapter 4. The Questions Begin. The drawing room at Blackthorn Manor, bathed in the muted light of a cloudy afternoon, felt stifling despite its grandeur. The heavy velvet curtains seemed to absorb the air, and the ticking of the ormolu clock on the mantel underscored the tension among the gathered guests. Hercule Poirot stood at the center of the room, his small, immaculate figure commanding attention as he prepared to question those present about the night of Major Caldwell's death. Captain Hastings, seated near the fireplace, watched his friend with a mixture of admiration and anticipation, knowing that Poirot's methodical approach would soon uncover cracks in the carefully constructed facades of the suspects. Poirot's eyes, sharp and unyielding, moved from face to face. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice precise and measured. "A man is dead, and the truth of his passing lies within this room. Hercule Poirot does not believe in chance, nor in the convenient explanations of suicide. I shall ask each of you to recount your movements last evening, and I warn you, every word, every gesture, it is observed." Lady Evelyn Ashbourne, seated in a high-backed chair, inclined her head. "Monsieur Poirot, we are all eager to assist. This tragedy has shaken us deeply." Her tone was smooth, but Hastings noted the slight tightening of her fingers around her teacup. Poirot began with Mrs. Clara Whitmore, whose earlier vivacity had been replaced by a nervous energy. She sat on the edge of a sofa, twisting her handkerchief. "Mrs. Whitmore, curious time to misplace such an item, no?" Dr. Reed's face reddened. "I'm rather forgetful, Monsieur Poirot. I realized I'd dropped it during dessert and stepped out to fetch it. I was only gone a moment." "And yet," Poirot said, tilting his head, "the hall is adjacent to the library. Did you see Major Caldwell leave the dining room, or anyone else near the library door?" "No, no one," Dr. Reed replied, his voice tight. "I was focused on finding my handkerchief." Poirot's mustache twitched, a sign Hastings recognized as mild skepticism. He moved on to Mr. Lionel Vance, who stood by the window, his broad shoulders squared as if bracing for a courtroom battle. "Mr. Vance, you remained at the dining table, yes? You saw nothing, heard nothing, until the scream?" Vance nodded brusquely. "That's right. I was enjoying my claret. Caldwell was there 1 minute, grumbling as usual. And then, well, I didn't notice him leave, too busy savoring the wine." His attempt at nonchalance fell flat, his eyes avoiding Poirot's. Miss Beatrice Lyle was next, her delicate frame almost lost in the armchair she occupied. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft but clear. "I was in the alcove admiring a portrait of Lady Ashbourne's great-grandmother. It's a remarkable painting, John Singer Sargent, I believe. I didn't see the Major leave, but I heard the scream. It was chilling." Poirot's eyes softened slightly, though his tone remained probing. "And the alcove, Mademoiselle Lyle. It is near the dining-room door. Did you see Dr. Reed pass by, or anyone else?" She hesitated, her fingers smoothing the fabric of her skirt. I don't recall. I was absorbed in the painting." Finally, Poirot turned to Lady Ashbourne. "Madame, you are at the head of the table, discussing the wine with your butler. You saw nothing of Major Caldwell's departure?" Lady Ashbourne met his gaze evenly. "Nothing, Monsieur Poirot. Simmons and I were discussing the cellar inventory. The Major..." Detective's presence. Hastings followed, eager to hear Poirot's thoughts. In the hall, Poirot's demeanor shifted from theatrical to analytical. "Hastings, mon ami, what did you observe during these interviews?" Hastings frowned, recalling the details. "They're all nervous, but that's to be expected. Mrs. Whitmore seemed evasive, and Dr. Reed's story about the handkerchief feels flimsy. Vance is too dismissive, and Miss Lyle, she's observant, but she's holding something back. Lady Ashbourne is almost too calm." "Précisément," Poirot said, his eyes gleaming. "Each tells a story, but the stories do not align. The powder room, the handkerchief, the painting, these are convenient excuses, but they lack precision. And the scream, who uttered it? None admit to it, yet it was heard by all." He paused, producing the 2 notes from his pocketbook. "These, Hastings, are the key. The warning you received and the scrap near the body. They are written in the same hand with the same ink. Someone knew of danger, or wished to create the illusion of it. But why mention midnight when the murder occurred at 9? Hastings rubbed his chin. Could the killer have planned the crime for later but acted early? "Perhaps," Poirot said. "Or perhaps the note is a distraction, a red herring to mislead us. We must return to the library. There is something I have not yet seen, something that will clarify the picture." Back in the library, Poirot moved with the precision of a watchmaker, his eyes scanning every surface. He paused at the desk where the silver cigarette case still lay open, its single crumpled cigarette a silent witness. "This case," he murmured, "it is too perfect, except for the cigarette. Why is it damaged, and why only one?" He knelt by the armchair, examining the chalk outline where Caldwell's body had been. His fingers traced the air above the floor, stopping at the rug where the scrap of paper had been found. "The rug, Hastings. It was moved slightly, yes? The police did not notice, but I see the indent command had combed the library and terrace for evidence, but their focus remained stubbornly fixed on the theory of suicide. The revolver, Major Caldwell's own, bore only his fingerprints, and the absence of footprints on the dew-soaked terrace seemed to seal their conclusion. Yet, Hercule Poirot, pacing the drawing room with the precision of a metronome, was far from convinced. Captain Hastings, seated with a notebook in hand, watched his friend's methodical mind at work, knowing that Poirot was already sifting through the tangle of alibis and half-truths. Poirot paused by the fireplace, his fingers brushing the bronze hawk statuette he had noted earlier. "Hastings, mon ami," he said, his voice low. "The inspector, he sees what is obvious, but the obvious is often a trap. The revolver, the open windows, the lack of footprints, these are the red herrings, designed to mislead. We must look beyond them to the subtleties." Hastings frowned, glancing at his notes. "But Poirot, the evidence does point to suicide. The gun was Caldwell's, and no one saw anyone enter or leave the library. Even the scream, nobody claims it." Poirot's mustache twitched with a faint smile. "Précisément, Hastings. It is the very neatness of the evidence that troubles me. A suicide, it leaves chaos, despair, disorder. This scene, it is staged, like a play. And the actors, they are not yet ready to reveal their roles." The guests had been permitted to gather in the drawing room, though the air was thick with suspicion. Inspector Grayson, standing by the door, announced his intention to release them to their rooms for the evening, pending further inquiries. "No need to keep you all cooped up," he said gruffly. "The case is clear enough. Major Caldwell took his own life. A sad business, but straightforward." Mrs. Clara Whitmore, her composure fraying, seized on this. "Oh, Inspector, surely you're right. Poor Major Caldwell. He was so dour last night, muttering about the war and his regrets. I saw him clutch that revolver at dinner, showing it off like a trophy, twisting tighter. Well, I didn't think it relevant until now. It's only in hindsight." "Hindsight," Poirot interrupted gently, "is a dangerous lens, madame. It distorts the truth. Tell me, did anyone see Major Caldwell leave the dining room after dessert?" A silence followed, broken only by the ticking clock. Miss Beatrice Lyle, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "I didn't see him leave, but I noticed his chair was empty just before the scream. I assumed he'd gone to the library to smoke. His cigarette case was on the table earlier." Poirot turned to her, his expression one of keen interest. "Mademoiselle Lyle, you are observant. The cigarette case, yes, most curious. Did you see him take it with him?" Miss Lyle hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. I'm not sure. I think it was still on the table when we left for the library." Lady Evelyn Ashbourne, who had remained silent, interjected smoothly. "The Major was fond of his cigarettes. He often retired to the library for a smoke after dinner. It was a habit of his, one I indulged as his hostess." Poirot nodded, but Hastings could tell he was unconvinced. the detective's attention returned to the group. Let us consider the timeline. Dessert ended at 8:45 p.m. The scream was heard at 9:02. In those 17 minutes, Major Caldwell left the dining room, entered the library, and was shot. Yet no one saw him go, and no one claims the scream. Curious, no? Inspector Grayson snorted. Not so curious, Mr. Poirot. He slipped out, shot himself, and someone, likely a maid, screamed when they found him. Simple. Poirot's smile was polite but icy. Simple, Inspector? No. Simplicity is the cloak of deception. I propose a different theory. Major Caldwell was murdered, and the killer is among us. A gasp rippled through the room. Mrs. Whitmore's hand flew to her mouth. Dr. Reed's spectacles slipped down his nose, and Vance's brandy glass froze mid-swirl. Only Miss Lyle and Lady Ashbourne remained composed, though so. But I could be mistaken. It was a hectic moment. Lady Ashbourne, overseeing the reenactment, remained unruffled. Her alibi corroborated by Simmons, the butler. Yet Poirot's eyes lingered on her, as if sensing something beneath her polished exterior. As the reconstruction ended, Poirot gathered the group once more. Mes amis, the red herrings multiply. The revolver, the despair, the empty terrace, they point to suicide. But they are too perfect, too convenient. The truth lies in the inconsistencies. The cigarette case, the notes, the scream. Someone in this room knows more than they say. He paused, his gaze sweeping over them. I shall return to the library now to examine what the police have overlooked. And I warn you, Hercule Poirot sees what others do not. The shadow that moves at midnight will not escape me. As the guests dispersed, Hastings caught up with Poirot in the hall. You're rattling them, Poirot. They're starting to point fingers at Caldwell's state of mind. But it feels rehearsed, don't you think? Oui, Hastings, Poirot replied, his voice low. They wish to close the case quickly, to bury the truth with the Major. But the little gray cells, they are not deceived. The cigarette case, the notes, the timing. These are the threads of a tapestry, and I shall unravel it. He turned toward the library, his step purposeful. Hastings followed, his mind racing with the possibility that the killer was not only among them, but had orchestrated a deception so clever it had nearly fooled them all. Chapter 6. A Clue in Detail. The library at Blackthorn Manor, now sealed off by Inspector Grayson's orders, felt like a vault of secrets as Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings slipped inside, the door clicking softly behind them. The late afternoon light filtered through the French windows, casting long shadows across the oak-paneled walls. The chalk outline of Major Caldwell's body remained on the armchair, a stark reminder of the violence that had shattered the manor's elegance. Poirot's eye of his silver case. Yet here, we find a single cigarette, damaged, and no ashtray. This is not the act of a man about to end his life. It is a message. Poirot knelt by the desk, his eyes fixed on the cigarette case. He produced a small magnifying glass from his pocket and examined the crumpled cigarette closely. Observe, Hastings. The paper is torn slightly, and the tobacco, it is not uniform. This is not a Turkish blend, it is something else. Perhaps a clue left by the killer, or a mistake. He turned his attention to the rug, where the torn scrap of paper with "At Midnight" had been found. The rug's edge was slightly askew, as he had noted earlier, and now he traced the carpet's fibers with his finger. The rug was moved, Hastings, but not by accident. See here, the fibers are flattened in a line, as if something was dragged across it. Not heavy, no, but deliberate. Hastings crouched beside him, squinting at the faint mark. You think the killer moved the rug to hide something? Or to place the note? Perhaps both, Poirot replied. He stood and crossed to the French windows, which remained ajar, their hinges creaking faintly in the breeze. He examined the latch, then the terrace beyond, his brow furrowing. No footprints, no disturbance in the dew. The windows, they are a distraction, meant to suggest an intruder who never existed. The killer was already in the house. Returning to the desk, Poirot's gaze fell on a small inkstand, its lid slightly askew. He lifted it carefully with his handkerchief, revealing a well of black ink and a pen with a nib still wet. Curieux, he murmured. The notes, your warning and the scrap, were written in black ink with a hurried hand. This pen, it was used recently. But by whom? And why leave it here, so carelessly? Hastings scribbled in his notebook, struggling to keep up. So the note wasn't written by Caldwell. Someone else wrote it, maybe to frame him or to throw us off the scent. Poirot, certain. But it struck me as strange that it's now nearly empty. Poirot's gaze sharpened. You are certain of this, mademoiselle? Several cigarettes, not one? I think so, she said, her voice faltering. It was a fleeting glance. I didn't want to seem nosy, so I looked away. Merci, Mademoiselle Lyle, Poirot said, his tone gentle but probing. Your observation is most valuable. And tell me, did you see anyone else near the table who might have touched the case? She shook her head. Not specifically. Everyone was moving about. Mrs. Whitmore left for the powder room. Dr. Reed stepped into the hall, and Mr. Vance was pacing near the door. I was in the alcove, so my view was limited. Poirot dismissed her with a nod, his mind already racing. Hastings, this is a breakthrough. The cigarette case. It was tampered with after the Major's death. Someone removed the cigarettes, leaving only the crumpled one. Why? To create a false impression, perhaps, or to hide something within the case. He returned to the case, examining its interior with his magnifying glass. Aha, he exclaimed softly. There is a faint residue, white, powdery, along the edge. Not tobacco, no, something else. We must have this analyzed, but I suspect it is no accident. Hastings leaned closer, his curiosity piqued. Poison, you think? Something to do with Sir Reginald's death, perhaps? Poirot's eyes gleamed. You leap ahead, mon ami, but you are not entirely wrong. The past, it casts a long shadow over Blackthorn Manor. Sir Reginald's death, the rumors of poison. These are not unconnected to our present mystery, but we must proceed with care. As they prepared to leave the library, Poirot paused, his gaze falling on the bronze hawk statuette on the mantel. He tilted his head, studying it intently. This hawk, Hastings, it is out of place. Its beak, it points toward the desk, not the room, as one would expect for display. Was it moved? Subtle contradiction at a time. Chapter 7. More lies surface. The evening at Blackthorn Manor descended with a heavy stillness, the air thick with unspoken suspicions. The guests, confined to the drawing room under Inspector Grayson's watchful eye, sat in uneasy silence, their earlier attempts at civility replaced by guarded glances. Hercule Poirot, his presence both a comfort and a threat, stood by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, his green eyes scanning the room like a hawk, aptly mirroring the bronze statuette he had examined earlier. Captain Hastings, seated with his notebook, felt the tension coiling tighter, sensing that Poirot's relentless probing was about to unearth something significant. Poirot began, his voice cutting through the silence with surgical precision. Mesdames et messieurs, the time for half-truths is over. Major Caldwell was murdered, and the killer sits among us. The clues, the cigarette case, the notes, the misplaced hawk, they point to a plan most meticulous. But plans, they leave traces, and lies, they unravel. Mrs. Clara Whitmore, her face pale beneath her rouge, clutched her handkerchief. Monsieur Poirot, this is intolerable. To accuse us when the police say it was suicide, why, it's absurd. Her voice trembled, but her eyes darted toward Dr. Malcolm Reed, who sat rigid, his spectacles fogged with perspiration. Poirot turned to the doctor, his tone deceptively mild. Dr. Reed, you have been most reticent about your movements. You claim to have sought a handkerchief in the hall at 9:02 p.m., yet Miss Lyle saw you near the library door moments before the scream. How do you explain this discrepancy? Dr. Reed's hands shook as he adjusted his spectacles. I may have wandered closer to the library than I realized. My nerves, you see. I'm not accustomed to such gatherings. I was disoriented. Disoriented, Poirot echoed, his eyebrow arching. A neurologist, disoriented by a simple dinner. Non, monsieur. I think you steady. But Hastings noted a slight tightening of her jaw. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Curieux. 2 accounts, yet one must be false. And you, Madame Whitmore, you spoke of the Major's despair, yet last night you described him as merely dour. Why this sudden recollection of his distress? Mrs. Whitmore's lips parted, but no sound came. She glanced at Vance, then quickly away. I was trying to be kind. I didn't want to speak ill of the dead. Poirot stepped closer, his presence commanding. Kindness, madame, does not obscure the truth. Let us speak of the cigarette case. Miss Lyle saw several cigarettes in it during dinner, yet only one remained when we found the body. Who tampered with it, and why? Miss Beatrice Lyle, who had been listening intently, spoke softly. I've been thinking about that, Monsieur Poirot. The case was on the dining table, but I recall Mrs. Whitmore passing by it when she returned from the powder room. Her sleeve brushed the table. I thought nothing of it at the time. Mrs. Whitmore gasped, her face flushing. That's outrageous. I never touched the case. I was nowhere near it. Her voice rose, cracking with indignation. Poirot raised a hand, silencing her. Calm yourself, madame. We shall verify. But there is more. The note found by Captain Hastings. Beware the shadow that moves at midnight. And the scrap in the library. At midnight. Were written with ink from the desk. Who among you had access to that desk before the murder? A heavy silence fell. Dr. Reed cleared his throat. I was in the library earlier that day, looking for a book on neurology. I may have glanced at the desk, but I didn't touch the inkstand. Poirot's gaze bore into him. And what book, pray, did you seek? The shelves are vast, yet you went straight to the desk. Dr. Reed stammered. I don't recall the title. Something about the brain. Poirot turned to Lady Ashburn. Madame, as hostess, you know they finding him insufferable, but insisted she had no personal grudge. Dr. Reed mentioned a heated argument at a medical conference years ago, though he claimed it was forgotten. Miss Lyle remained silent, her eyes fixed on her hands, but Hastings sensed she was withholding something. Lady Ashburn spoke last, her tone measured. Major Caldwell was a friend of my late husband, Sir Reginald. They served together in the war. If he had enemies, they were not in this house. Poirot's smile was enigmatic. Perhaps, madame. But enemies, they wear many faces. The past, it lingers, does it not? Like the shadow of Sir Reginald's death. A gasp escaped Mrs. Whitmore, and Dr. Reed's spectacles slipped down his nose. Lady Ashburn's composure faltered for a fraction of a second, her fingers tightening on her teacup. As the group dispersed, Poirot pulled Hastings aside. The lies, Hastings, they are like threads pulling apart. Vance's talk of debts, Whitmore's evasion, Reed's improbable story, and Lady Ashburn's careful omissions, they all hide something. And Miss Lyle, she sees more than she says. We must watch her closely. Hastings nodded, his mind racing. What about the cigarette case residue you mentioned? Could it be poison, like with Sir Reginald? Poirot's eyes darkened. It is possible, mon ami. The residue, it must be analyzed. But more than that, the cigarette case is a symbol, a clue to the killer's intent. Tomorrow we shall set a trap, for the shadow that moves at midnight is growing restless. As they retired to their rooms, the manor's corridor seemed to pulse with secrets, each guest a potential liar, each clue a step closer to the truth Poirot was determined to uncover. Chapter 8. The Emotional Turning Point. The atmosphere in Blackthorn Manor had grown oppressive by the second evening, as if the walls themselves were closing in on the secrets they harbored. The guests, now weary from Hercule Poirot's relentless questioning, gathered in the drawing room under the pretext of an early supper, though few had an appetite. The nervous tick of adjusting his spectacles ceased, his face pale. Mr. Lionel Vance, usually so boisterous, stared into his brandy, his jaw tight. Miss Beatrice Lyle's hands were folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the floor. Lady Evelyn Ashbourne, ever composed, watched Poirot with an intensity that bordered on defiance. It was Miss Lyle who broke the silence, her voice soft but trembling with emotion. Monsieur Poirot, I must speak. I can't bear this any longer. Her words, barely above a whisper, drew every eye in the room. She raised her head, her delicate features etched with anguish. Major Caldwell. He was my uncle. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Hastings leaned forward, his pen frozen above his notebook. Even Poirot's mustache twitched in surprise, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of satisfaction, as if he had anticipated a revelation. Your uncle, Mademoiselle Lyle, Poirot said, his tone gentle but probing. This is most significant. Why did you not mention this before? Miss Lyle's hands twisted in her lap, her voice breaking. I was ashamed. He wasn't proud of me. My mother, his sister, married against the family's wishes, a man of no standing. Uncle Ernest cut her off, and when she died he refused to acknowledge me until recently. He invited me here, saying he wanted to make amends, but he was cruel. He taunted me, saying I'd never inherit, that I was a disgrace to the Caldwell name. Her words spilled out, raw and unfiltered, and Hastings saw tears glisten in her eyes. Mrs. Whitmore reached out, placing a hand on Miss Lyle's arm, but the gesture seemed more performative than genuine. Poirot stepped closer, his gaze softening. "Mademoiselle, your candor is a light in this darkness. Tell me, did you see your uncle in the library that evening? Did you speak with him?" Miss Lyle shook her head, her voice choked. "No," reddened, his brandy glass slamming onto the table. "That's preposterous. I'm a man of means, Poirot. I was merely repeating what I heard. Caldwell was in debt. I'd wager my reputation on it." Lady Ashbourne's voice cut through, calm but sharp. "Mr. Vance, you overstep. I told you, no such conversation occurred. If you heard anything, it was not from me." The room crackled with tension, accusations and denials colliding like sparks. Hastings scribbled furiously, noting the shift in dynamics. Miss Lyle's revelation had opened a floodgate, exposing raw emotions and hidden connections. He glanced at Poirot, who stood motionless, his eyes darting from one guest to another, as if piecing together a puzzle only he could see. Poirot raised a hand, silencing the room. "Enough. Miss Lyle's confession is a turning point, but it is not the whole truth. Major Caldwell's death is tied to the past, to secrets of family, of wealth, and perhaps of betrayal. The cigarette case, the notes, the hawk statuette, these are not random. They point to a killer who planned carefully, yet whose heart betrayed them." He turned to Lady Ashbourne, his gaze piercing. "Madame, you knew Major Caldwell through your late husband, Sir Reginald. Was there perhaps a connection between their deaths? Rumors of poison surrounded Sir Reginald. Could the Major have known something dangerous?" Lady Ashbourne's composure faltered, her teacup clattering slightly as she set it down. "Monsieur Poirot, you tread on delicate ground. My husband died of a heart attack, as the coroner confirmed. Major Caldwell was his friend, nothing more. To suggest otherwise is offensive." Poirot inclined his head, but his eyes never left her. "Offense is not my intent, madame, but truth is. The residue in the cigarette case, it is being analyzed. If it is poison, as I suspect, it links this murder to the past. Someone in this room knows more than they say." Mrs. Whitmore let out a stifled sob, and Dr. Reed's spectacles slipped entirely, clattering to the floor. Vance muttered something inaudible. His flickering sconces seemed to pulse with the weight of Miss Lyle's confession. Hastings felt the case tipping toward a climax, the emotional cracks in the suspects' stories revealing a truth that Poirot was poised to seize. Chapter 9. The Trap. The third morning at Blackthorn Manor dawned with a heavy mist that clung to the estate's lawns, shrouding the world in a veil of uncertainty. The guests, worn down by 2 days of suspicion, and Hercule Poirot's unrelenting scrutiny, gathered in the drawing room with palpable dread. The air was thick with the scent of coffee, and the unspoken fear that the Belgian detective was closing in on the truth. Captain Hastings, seated near the window with his notebook, watched Poirot with anticipation, sensing that his friend was about to spring a trap as cunning as the murder itself. Poirot stood before the fireplace, the bronze hawk statuette gleaming behind him, its beak still pointing incongruously toward the desk in the library. His posture was erect, his mustache impeccably groomed. But his eyes burned with a quiet intensity that silenced the room. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice carrying a weight that made even Inspector Grayson, lingering by the door, pause. "The time has come to end this charade. Major Ernest Caldwell was murdered, and the killer is among us. Tonight, we shall gather in the library, and the truth, it shall be revealed." A murmur of unease rippled through the group. Mrs. Clara Whitmore's hands trembled as she clutched her shawl, her earlier theatrics replaced by a haunted expression. Dr. Malcolm Reed adjusted his spectacles, his fingers fumbling. Mr. Lionel Vance, his bravado diminished, gripped his brandy glass tightly, while Miss Beatrice Lyle sat with her hands clasped, her face pale but resolute. Lady Evelyn Ashbourne, ever the composed hostess, met Poirot's gaze with a faint smile, though Hastings noted a flicker of tension in her posture. "What do you mean, Monsieur Poirot?" Vance demanded, his voice strained. "This talk of a trap, it's theatrics, nothing more. The police say it's suicide. Why drag this out?" Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "Monsieur Vance, the police see what is presented to them. A revolver." Reed cleared his throat, his voice unsteady. "Monsieur Poirot, this seems unnecessary. I was in the hall as I said. I saw nothing. What can this prove?" Poirot's gaze was piercing. "It will prove, Dr. Reed, what you did not see, or what you chose not to see. The little gray cells, they have been working, and they tell me that the truth lies in the moments before the scream." Miss Lyle spoke softly, her voice steady despite her evident fear. "I'll do it, Monsieur Poirot. If it helps find my uncle's killer, I'll take my place in the alcove." Poirot nodded, his expression softening briefly. "Merci, Mademoiselle Lyle. Your courage is noted." Lady Ashbourne rose, her silk dress rustling. "Monsieur Poirot, I trust your methods, though they are unconventional. We shall comply, but I must insist that my staff be kept out of this. They are blameless." Poirot inclined his head. "For now, madame, the staff are not my concern. It is the guests who hold the key to this mystery." As the group dispersed to prepare for the evening, Hastings caught up with Poirot in the hall. "You're taking a risk, Poirot," he whispered. "This reenactment, what if the killer uses it to cover their tracks further?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Mon ami, that is precisely the point. The killer, they are clever, but they are also human. Under pressure, they will make a mistake, a glance, a hesitation, a word too many. The trap, it is not in the library alone, but in their minds." Hastings frowned, scribbling in his notebook. "You think the residue in the cigarette case is the key, don't you? Poison, like with Sir Reginald?" Poirot nodded, producing a small envelope from his pocket. "The residue, it has been analyzed by a chemist friend in London. It is cyanide, Hastings, a deadly poison, odorless in small quantities. The crumpled cigarette, it was laced with it, but Major Caldwell did not smoke it. Why? Because the killer intended it for another purpose, or perhaps another victim." Hastings's eyes widened. Mrs. Whitmore entered, her steps hesitant, her eyes darting to the cigarette case on the desk. Dr. Reed lingered in the hall, his spectacles glinting as he glanced toward the library door. Vance, feigning nonchalance, sipped a glass of water meant to represent his claret. Miss Lyle stood in the alcove, her gaze fixed on an imaginary painting. Lady Ashbourne remained near the door, her posture regal but tense. At 9:02, Poirot clapped his hands sharply, mimicking the scream. The guests froze, their reactions telling. Mrs. Whitmore flinched, her hand brushing the desk. Dr. Reed stepped forward, then stopped, his face pale. Vance's glass slipped, spilling water across the table. Miss Lyle turned, her eyes wide, while Lady Ashbourne's expression remained unreadable. Poirot's voice was calm but commanding. And now, the moment of truth. One of you moved differently tonight. One of you revealed what you hid that night. The shadow, it moves, and I see it. Mrs. Whitmore burst into tears, collapsing onto a chair. I can't bear it. I didn't kill him, but I saw something that night. I lied about the powder room. I was near the library and I heard voices, angry voices, before the scream. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Voices, madame? Whose? She shook her head, sobbing. I couldn't tell. A man and a woman, arguing. I was afraid, so I ran back to the dining room. The room erupted in murmurs, but Poirot raised a hand. Enough! The trap, it has sprung. The voices, the cigarette, the notes, they converge. Tomorrow, we shall gather once more, and the killer will have no place to hide. As the guests dispersed, Hastings whispered, You've got them rattled, Poirot. Mrs. Whitmore's confession. Is it genuine, or another lie? Poirot's smile was grim. It is genuine, Hastings, but incomplete. Heard by Madame Whitmore. They have spoken, and Hercule Poirot has listened. Mrs. Whitmore let out a stifled sob, clutching her handkerchief. Dr. Reed's spectacles slipped down his nose, his hands trembling. Vance's bravado had vanished, his brandy glass untouched. Miss Lyle's eyes were wide, her hands clasped tightly, while Lady Ashbourne maintained her regal composure, though her fingers tightened on her chair. Poirot paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. Let us begin with this scene. Major Caldwell was found in this library at 9:02 p.m., shot through the temple with his own revolver. The French windows were open, yet no footprints marked the terrace. The police, they saw suicide, a tidy explanation. But the little gray cells, they saw more. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. The cigarette case, it was the first clue. A single crumpled cigarette laced with cyanide, yet Major Caldwell did not smoke it. Why? Because it was not meant for him. The case, mon ami, was tampered with after his death to create confusion. Miss Lyle saw several cigarettes during dinner, yet only one remained. Someone removed the others, leaving the poisoned one to suggest a different crime. Miss Lyle gasped softly, her voice trembling. But who would do that, and why? Poirot raised a hand. Patience, mademoiselle. Next, the notes. Beware the shadow that moves at midnight, and the scrap saying, at midnight. Written in black ink from the desk, in a hurried hand. They suggested a crime planned for later, yet the murder occurred at 9. Why the discrepancy? Because the killer was forced to act early, disrupted by an unforeseen event. He turned to Mrs. Whitmore, whose tears had subsided into a nervous fidgeting. Madame, You admitted to hearing voices, a man and a woman, arguing near the library before the scream. You lied about the powder room, but your confession, it was the key. Those voices, Madame, you have been the picture of composure, yet your connection to Major Caldwell and to your late husband, Sir Reginald, holds the heart of this mystery. Sir Reginald died of a supposed heart attack, yet whispers of poison lingered. Major Caldwell, his old friend, knew something, did he not? Something that made him dangerous. Lady Ashbourne's smile was icy. Monsieur Poirot, you weave a fascinating tale, but you have no proof. My husband's death was investigated and closed. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Proof, madame? It is here, in the details. The cyanide in the cigarette case links this murder to the past. Major Caldwell was shot, but the cyanide was meant for another, or to create a false narrative. The voices Madame Whitmore heard, they were yours and the Major's, arguing about Sir Reginald's death. A gasp echoed through the room. Lady Ashbourne's composure cracked, her eyes narrowing. That is absurd. I was in the dining room, as Simmons confirmed. Oui, but Simmons, he is loyal to you, Poirot said. And loyalty, it can blind. The truth, it is this. Major Caldwell suspected you of poisoning Sir Reginald. He came to Blackthorn Manor to confront you, perhaps to blackmail you. You invited him, and these others, to create a stage for your plan. But he grew impatient, argued with you in the library, and you acted. Not at midnight as planned, but at 9. Lady Ashbourne rose, her voice sharp. This is slander. You accuse me with no evidence. Poirot held up a hand, producing the torn note. The evidence, it is here. The ink matches the desk. The handwriting matches a letter you wrote to Hastings inviting him here. You wrote the notes to create a mystery, to suggest an outside threat. But you miscalculated. The Major's revolver, wiped clean except for his prints, was placed by his hand after death. The cyanide cigarette, a distraction to confuse the motive. And the hawk, moved to hide a key to your private safe, where you stepped forward, his face grim. Lady Ashbourne, you'll need to come with me. As Lady Ashbourne was led away, her head held high despite the handcuffs, Poirot turned to Hastings. The shadow that moves at midnight, mon ami. It was her. Always her. The little gray cells, they do not fail. The library fell silent, the weight of the truth settling over Blackthorn Manor like a shroud, as Poirot's genius brought the mystery to its shattering close. Chapter 11. The Reflection. The morning after Lady Evelyn Ashbourne's dramatic unmasking as Major Ernest Caldwell's killer, Blackthorn Manor seemed to exhale, its oppressive atmosphere lightening, though a somber air lingered. The mist that had cloaked the estate for days had lifted, revealing a pale sun that bathed the lawns in a tentative glow. The remaining guests, Mrs. Clara Whitmore, Dr. Malcolm Reed, Mr. Lionel Vance, and Miss Beatrice Lyle, gathered in the drawing room, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The police had departed with Lady Ashbourne in custody, and Inspector Grayson, though grudgingly impressed by Poirot's deductions, had left to file his report. Only Captain Hastings and Hercule Poirot remained, preparing to depart for London. Poirot stood by the window, his small, immaculate figure silhouetted against the light, his hands clasped behind his back. His green eyes, usually so piercing, were softened by a contemplative air. Hastings, packing his notebook into his suitcase, approached his friend, sensing that Poirot was about to share one of his philosophical reflections, a hallmark of their case's conclusions. "Poirot," Hastings began, his voice low, "you were brilliant last night. The way you pieced it all together, the cigarette case, the notes, the hawk. It was like watching a maestro conduct a symphony. But how did you know it was Lady Ashbourne from the start?" Poirot turned, his mustache twitching with a faint smile. "Not from the start, mon ami, but early. The little gray cells, they are restless when faced with disorder masquerading as order. Lady Ashbourne's composure, it was too cannot be hidden from Hercule Poirot." He paused, gazing out at the manicured gardens. "This case, Hastings, it reminds us of the frailty of the human heart. Lady Ashbourne, she was driven by fear, fear of exposure, of losing her status, her wealth. Yet in her fear she wove a web that ensnared her. The heart, it betrays even the cleverest mind." Hastings scribbled a final note, his pen pausing as he absorbed Poirot's words. "You always see the human side, don't you? Not just the clues, but what drives people to such extremes." Poirot inclined his head, his eyes distant. "The clues, they are the map, but the motives, they are the journey. To understand why a person kills, one must understand their soul. Lady Ashbourne, she believed herself untouchable. But no one is above the truth." The sound of footsteps interrupted them. Miss Beatrice Lyle entered, her delicate features softened by gratitude. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings," she said, her voice steady despite the shadows under her eyes. "I wanted to thank you before you leave. My uncle, he was not a kind man, but he deserved justice. You gave him that." Poirot bowed slightly. "Mademoiselle, justice is the duty of Hercule Poirot. Your candor, it helped illuminate the path. I wish you peace." Miss Lyle hesitated, then added, "I'll be leaving Blackthorn Manor today. There's nothing for me here now, but I'll carry this lesson forward. To face the truth, no matter how painful." As she left, Hastings turned to Poirot. "She's stronger than she looks, isn't she?" "Oui," Poirot replied. "The quiet ones, they often are." Her revelation about her uncle, it was the crack that broke the dam. Without it, Lady Ashbourne might have slipped away. The other guests appeared briefly to bid farewell, their interactions subdued. Mrs. Whitmore, her tears dried, offered a tremulous smile, her earlier histrionics replaced by a quiet shame. Dr. Reed, his nervous tics subdued, mumbled his lips. "But I confess I was thrown by the red herrings. The open windows, the suicide theory. You saw through them from the start." Poirot chuckled softly. "Not from the start, mon ami. But the little gray cells, they are patient. They wait for the pattern to emerge. In life as in murder, the truth is simple. It is the lies that are complicated." As the taxi rolled through the Sussex countryside, Poirot leaned back, his eyes half closed, a contented smile playing on his lips. "Now, Hastings, we return to London, to order and symmetry. But the heart, it will always surprise us, no? And that is why Hercule Poirot will never tire of its mysteries." The manor faded into the distance, its shadows dispelled, leaving only the quiet satisfaction of a case solved and a truth laid bare. Chapter 12. The Unseen Thread. The train to London rattled through the Sussex countryside, its rhythmic clatter a soothing contrast to the tension that had gripped Blackthorn Manor. Hercule Poirot sat opposite Captain Hastings in their first-class compartment, his small hands folded neatly over a copy of the Times, though his eyes were fixed on the passing fields, lost in thought. Hastings, his suitcase stowed above, scribbled in his notebook, attempting to capture the intricacies of the case for posterity. Yet a nagging unease lingered, a sense that some detail remained unresolved despite Poirot's triumphant reveal. "Poirot," Hastings ventured, setting down his pen. "You were masterful, as always." Lady Ashbourne's confession, or rather, her inability to deny the evidence, was a spectacle. But something bothers me. The notes. Beware the shadow that moves at midnight, and at midnight. Why were they so specific? And why leave them at all, if she meant to stage a suicide? Poirot's mustache twitched, a sign that Hastings's question had struck a chord. "Mon cher Hastings, you are learning to see the shadows beneath the shadows." The notes. They are the unseen thread in this tapestry, the one clue that nearly escaped even Hercule Poirot. Woman were not only Lady Ashbourne and Major Caldwell. There was another player in this drama, one who has remained in the shadows. The train lurched slightly, and Poirot adjusted his hat, his mind clearly racing. Consider, Hastings. The cigarette case with its cyanide-laced cigarette. It was a clumsy distraction, not in keeping with Lady Ashbourne's meticulous nature. The hawk statuette moved to conceal a key. Why leave it so carelessly? These were not her errors alone. Someone else tampered with the scene, perhaps to protect her, or to ensure her guilt was exposed. Hastings frowned, flipping through his notes. But who? Mrs. Whitmore was a nervous wreck. Dr. Reed's story was flimsy. Vance was too eager to push the suicide theory. And Miss Lyle, well, her confession about her uncle seemed genuine. Poirot nodded, his gaze distant. Miss Lyle, she is the key. Her revelation, it was heartfelt, but it came too late. Why did she not speak of her connection to Caldwell earlier, and her observation of the cigarette case? She saw it had several cigarettes, yet she hesitated to confirm it. I suspect she knew more than she admitted, perhaps not of the murder itself, but of the events leading to it. Hastings's eyes widened. You think Miss Lyle was protecting someone? Or could she have been involved? Poirot shook his head. Not in the act of murder, no. But she is young, impressionable, and her uncle's cruelty left scars. If she overheard Lady Ashbourne and Caldwell arguing, or if she found the note in the library, she might have acted to shield someone, or to ensure justice. We must return to Blackthorn Manor, Hastings. Return? Hastings exclaimed, nearly dropping his notebook. But the case is closed. Lady Ashbourne is in custody. Poirot's smile was grim. The case is closed only when every thread is tied. There is one loose end, and it lies with Miss Lyle. I have telegraphed Inspector Grayson to detain the guests for one more day. We shall arrive this evening and confront the unseen thread. By dusk, the taxi wound its cruelty. Did you not? And you knew of his suspicions about Sir Reginald's death. Tell me, what did you overhear in the library that night? Tears welled in Miss Lyle's eyes, and she clutched her hands together. I didn't want to say. I was in the alcove, and I heard them. Lady Ashbourne and Uncle Ernest. He was accusing her of poisoning Sir Reginald, saying he had proof in letters he'd kept. She begged him to stay silent, offered him money, but he refused. I was afraid for her. Poirot nodded, his eyes softening. "And the note, mademoiselle, the one warning of the shadow at midnight. You found it, did you not? And you placed the torn scrap in the library to ensure we looked closer." Miss Lyle sobbed, nodding. "I found it on the desk after dinner, before the scream. I didn't know what it meant, but I was terrified. I tore off part of it and left it under the rug, hoping someone would find it. I didn't want her to get away with it, but I couldn't bear to accuse her myself." The room was silent, the weight of her confession settling over them. Poirot stepped closer, his voice kind. "You did right, mademoiselle. Your courage brought the truth to light. Lady Ashbourne acted alone in the murder, but your actions ensured her deception was uncovered." As Inspector Grayson took Miss Lyle's statement, Poirot turned to Hastings. "The unseen thread, mon ami. It was her conscience. She could not let the shadow pass unnoticed." The manor, now fully stripped of its secrets, stood quiet as Poirot and Hastings prepared to leave once more. The case at last was truly closed, its final piece woven into the tapestry of truth by Poirot's unrelenting pursuit of order. Chapter 13. The Echoes of Truth. The drawing room at Blackthorn Manor, though still grand with its velvet curtains and polished mahogany, felt diminished in the wake of Miss Beatrice Lyle's confession. The late evening light filtered through the tall windows, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to mirror the lingering unease among the guests. Hercule Poirot. "Mesdames et messieurs, the truth has been laid bare, yet its echoes remain. Major Caldwell's murder, it was not merely a crime of the moment, but a tapestry woven from the threads of the past. Miss Lyle's courage illuminated the final piece, but there are questions yet unanswered, details that linger in the shadows." Mrs. Whitmore, her eyes red from crying, looked up, her voice trembling. "Monsieur Poirot, what more can there be?" "Lady Ashbourne killed him, and Miss Lyle helped you find the truth. Surely it's over." Poirot's mustache twitched, his gaze steady. "Madame, a case is not closed until every thread is accounted for. The notes, the cyanide, the hawk. They were Lady Ashbourne's tools, oui. But there is one detail that troubles Hercule Poirot. The scream. Who uttered it, and why?" Hastings leaned forward, his pen poised. "I thought you said it was Lady Ashbourne, Poirot, to draw us to the library and stage the suicide." Poirot nodded, but his eyes were distant. "Oui, Hastings. That was my conclusion. But the scream. It was described as piercing, filled with terror. Lady Ashbourne, she is a woman of control. Would she risk such a display, knowing it would draw attention before her plan was complete? I begin to wonder if another voice cried out. Perhaps one who saw more than they admitted." Dr. Reed adjusted his spectacles, his nervous tic returning. "Monsieur Poirot, you can't mean to drag this out further. I was in the hall, as I said. I heard the scream, but I saw nothing. No one near the library." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "And yet, Dr. Reed, your presence in the hall places you closest to the crime. You claim disorientation, but a neurologist, he does not lose his bearings so easily. Tell me, what did you see, or hear, before the scream?" Dr. Reed's face paled, his hands fumbling. I told you. Nothing. I was looking for..." Poirot nodded, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Merci, Dr. Reed. Your silence, It protected no one but yourself. The scream. It was not Lady Ashbourne's, but Miss Lyle's. She was in the alcove, closer than she admitted, and she saw or heard the murder. Her terror, it was genuine, and it forced Lady Ashbourne to act quickly, to stage the suicide before the scene could be disturbed. Hastings scribbled furiously, his mind racing. So Miss Lyle screamed, not knowing it would unravel the plan? Précisément, Poirot said. Her scream was the echo of truth, the moment that disrupted Lady Ashbourne's careful design. She placed the note, hoping to draw attention to the crime, but her fear betrayed her presence. The killer. She was forced to act at 9, not midnight, because of Miss Lyle's unwitting interference. Poirot turned to the group, his voice rising. This case, it is a lesson in the power of the human conscience. Miss Lyle, torn by her uncle's cruelty, sought justice in her own way. Dr. Reed, bound by fear, hid what he knew. Madame Whitmore, you saw and heard, yet chose to flee. Monsieur Vance, your lies about debts were a shield for your own unease. Each of you played a part, however small, in the tapestry of this crime. The guests sat in stunned silence, their secrets laid bare. Poirot's gaze softened as he addressed them. The truth, it is painful, but it is also freeing. Major Caldwell's death has been avenged. And Blackthorn Manor, it will heal in time. As the guests dispersed, Hastings followed Poirot to the hall, where their coats awaited. You've done it again, Poirot, he said, a note of admiration in his voice. You saw what no one else did. The scream, the timing, Miss Lyle's role. But how did you know Dr. Reed was hiding something? Poirot's eyes twinkled. The little gray cells, Hastings. They noticed the pause, the glance, the tremor. Dr. Reed's disorientation. It was a lie too flimsy for a man of science. His silence spoke louder than his words. As they stepped into the waiting taxi, the manor receded into the twilight, its grandeur now weaving through the final threads of the case. The notebook in Hastings's lap was nearly full, its pages crowded with the twists and turns of a mystery that had unraveled with Poirot's characteristic brilliance. Poirot, Hastings said, breaking the silence. You've tied up nearly every loose end. Lady Ashbourne's guilt, Miss Lyle's scream, Dr. Reed's silence. But there's one thing I still don't understand. The cyanide in the cigarette case. Why include it at all? If Lady Ashbourne shot Caldwell, why bother with a poisoned cigarette that was never used? Poirot's eyes opened, gleaming with the spark of a mind still engaged. Mon cher Hastings, you touch upon the final thread, the one that nearly escaped even Hercule Poirot. The cyanide. It was not a mere distraction, but a contingency, a plan within a plan. Lady Ashbourne, she is a woman of foresight. The cigarette, laced with cyanide, was her insurance should the staged suicide fail to convince. Hastings frowned, his pen hovering. Insurance? You mean she intended to use it on someone else? Perhaps, Poirot said, his voice low and deliberate. Or perhaps it was meant for Caldwell, should he survive the confrontation. The cyanide, it is odorless in small doses, easily hidden in a cigarette. Had the shot not killed him instantly, she might have offered him a cigarette to calm his nerves. A fatal gesture. But the scream, Miss Lyle's scream, it disrupted her timing. She had no chance to use it, so she left the case with its single poisoned cigarette to confuse us. Hastings scribbled, his mind racing. So the cigarette was a backup plan, abandoned when Miss Lyle's scream forced her to act quickly. That's devilishly clever. Oui, Poirot said, his mustache twitching. Lady Ashbourne, she wove a web of deception, but the web, it was fragile. The notes, the hawk, the cyanide. They were meant to create a labyrinth, to lead us away from the truth. But the truth, it is like a beacon. It shines through even the darkest deception. Smile was enigmatic. Not involved, mon ami, but aware. Someone who suspected, who watched, who waited. The little gray cells, they suggest a possibility. Dr. Reed, with his nervous tics and vague alibis. His specialty, neurology, it includes knowledge of poisons, does it not? He was in the hall close to the library, and his silence, it was not merely fear. It was guilt, Hastings gasped. You think Dr. Reed knew about Sir Reginald's poisoning? That he was protecting Lady Ashbourne? Not protecting, Poirot corrected, but observing. He suspected her role in Sir Reginald's death, perhaps from medical inconsistencies he noticed at the time. He said nothing, fearing her influence. But when Caldwell began to threaten her, Dr. Reed saw an opportunity, or a danger. His presence near the library, it was no accident. He was listening, waiting, perhaps hoping to intervene. Hastings scribbled furiously, the pieces falling into place. So, Dr. Reed's silence wasn't just cowardice, it was self-preservation. He knew too much, and Lady Ashbourne knew he knew. Précisément, Poirot said. The final thread, it is this. The murder of Major Caldwell was not only to silence him, but to protect a secret shared by others. Dr. Reed, he will not face charges, for he did not kill, but his conscience, it will punish him more than any court. The train pulled into Victoria Station, and the bustle of London enveloped them as they stepped onto the platform. Hastings tucked his notebook away, his mind still reeling. You've done it again, Poirot. You saw what no one else could, the connections, the motives, the hidden truths. Poirot adjusted his hat, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. The truth, Hastings, it is like a symphony. Each note must be played, each instrument in harmony. At Blackthorn Manor the notes were discordant, but the little gray cells, they brought order to the chaos. As they hailed a taxi, Poirot paused, his gaze distant. This case. Poirot, Hastings said, closing his notebook with a sigh. This case at Blackthorn Manor. It's one for the books. Lady Ashbourne's cunning, Miss Lyle's conscience, Dr. Reed's silence. It was a web of motives and lies. But you untangled it, as always. Still, I can't help feeling there's a shadow left, something we haven't fully grasped. Poirot sipped his tea, his mustache curling slightly. Mon cher Hastings, you are correct. There is always a shadow. For human nature, it is never fully illuminated. But the case, it is resolved. Lady Ashbourne will face justice for Major Caldwell's murder, and the truth of Sir Reginald's death, it has been laid bare. Yet you are right to sense a lingering darkness. It is the nature of such crimes. They leave echoes in the hearts of all who were touched. Hastings leaned forward, his brow furrowed. You mean Dr. Reed, don't you? His knowledge of Sir Reginald's poisoning, his refusal to speak. Will he carry that guilt forever? Poirot nodded, setting his teacup down with precision. Dr. Reed, he is a man of science, but also of weakness. He knew, or suspected, that Lady Ashbourne poisoned her husband, yet he remained silent, fearing her power, or perhaps his own complicity. His silence had allowed Caldwell's murder to unfold. He will not face a court, but his conscience. It will be his judge." Hastings shook his head, marveling. And Miss Lyle, what courage to place that torn note, to scream when she heard the shot. She's so young, yet she tipped the scales. Oui, Poirot said, his voice softening. Mademoiselle Lyle, she is the heart of this story. Her love for her uncle, despite his cruelty, and her fear of Lady Ashbourne's secret, they drove her to act. The scream, it was not planned, but it was the spark that ignited the truth. Without it, Lady Ashbourne might have escaped. Poirot rose, pacing slowly across the room, his hands clasped behind his back. This case, Hastings, it teaches us much. The little gray cell. Poirot read it quickly, his expression shifting to one of mild curiosity. It is from Inspector Grayson. Lady Ashbourne has confessed fully, confirming our deductions. The letters from Caldwell detailed her use of cyanide in Sir Reginald's death, a slow poison, masked as a heart attack. She killed Caldwell to prevent his exposure, but she admits no accomplice. The case, it is closed. Hastings let out a breath, relieved. So that's it then. No more shadows at midnight. Poirot's smile was enigmatic. For now, Hastings. But the world, it is full of shadows. And the little gray cells, they are always ready. As the sun dipped below the London skyline, Poirot poured another cup of tea, offering one to Hastings. The two men sat in companionable silence, the weight of Blackthorn Manor fading into memory. The case had been a labyrinth of deception, but Poirot's relentless logic had illuminated every corner, leaving no secret unturned. Another adventure concluded, Hastings said, raising his cup in a mock toast. To the little gray cells, and to the next mystery. Poirot clinked his cup against Hastings's, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. To the truth, mon ami, and to the shadows that await us. The curtain fell on the case of Blackthorn Manor, its echoes fading into the quiet rhythm of London life, as Hercule Poirot prepared for the inevitable call of the next enigma.